November 18, 1942. Benghazi, Libya, inside a commandeered Italian villa that served as Wehrmacht intelligence headquarters for North Africa. Oberst Heinrich Bremer sat across from a captured British soldier who would not speak, would not break, and, most unsettling, would not stop smiling. The prisoner wore no insignia, carried no identification, and possessed skills that defied Bremer's understanding of military training. He'd been caught 3 days earlier after destroying 17 Luftwaffe aircraft on a single airfield. An interrogation had yielded nothing except that disconcerting smile. Bremer, a decorated officer who'd interrogated hundreds of prisoners across 2 wars, wrote in his daily report, "This is not a soldier in any conventional sense. This is something we have not encountered before." The prisoner was Lieutenant David Sterling's man, one of the original members of L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade. Within 18 months, that unit would become the most feared name in German North African operations, not through overwhelming force but through something the Wehrmacht found impossible to counter: absolute adaptability married to surgical precision. By 1944, senior German officers would document with reluctant admiration why they could never break the SAS. The answer wasn't superior weapons or numbers. It was something far more dangerous, a fundamental reimagining of what soldiers could be. To understand why the Germans couldn't break the SAS requires understanding what the SAS actually was in those early years, and more importantly, what it wasn't. It wasn't a massive force. At its peak in North Africa, it numbered fewer than 400 men. It wasn't particularly well equipped. They used modified civilian jeeps because proper military vehicles weren't available. It wasn't even officially recognized by much of the British military establishment, which viewed special forces with suspicion and contempt. What the SAS was in 1941 was an experiment born from desperation and one man's refusal to accept conventional limitations. David Sterling, a young officer recovering from a parachute training accident, had written a memo proposing a radical concept: small teams of highly trained soldiers operating deep behind enemy lines, living off minimal supplies, striking critical targets and disappearing before the enemy could respond. The idea violated every principle of conventional warfare. Armies fought in formations, with supply lines, with clear command structures. Sterling proposed the opposite: autonomous units, self-sufficient, trained to think independently, operating without direct oversight. The British High Command initially rejected the proposal. Only the desperate situation in North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps was dominating conventional forces, gave Sterling's idea a chance. In July 1941, he received permission to form L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. The name itself was deception. There was no brigade, and the Air Service designation was deliberately vague to confuse enemy intelligence. Sterling's recruiting criteria were unconventional. He wanted men who could think independently, who chafed under normal military discipline, who possessed what he called controlled audacity. He recruited from commando units, from disappointed conventional soldiers, from anyone who showed the right combination of intelligence, physical capability, and creative aggression. The training was brutal. Candidates marched across deserts carrying equipment that would break normal soldiers. They learned navigation by stars, survival on minimal water, weapons handling in darkness, Arabic language basics, vehicle maintenance, radio operation, demolition techniques, first aid, and most importantly, decision-making under stress without orders from above. 60% washed out. Those who remained formed something unprecedented in military history. Soldiers trained to be strategists, tacticians trained to be autonomous, specialists trained to be generalists. When they finally deployed in November 1941, German intelligence had no classification for them. The first SAS raid was a disaster. On November 16, 1941, 55 men parachuted into the desert to attack German airfields. High winds scattered them across miles of desert. Many were injured on landing. The rendezvous failed. Equipment was lost. German patrols captured or killed most of the force. Only 22 men made it back to British lines. By conventional military metrics, the operation was catastrophic. A 60% casualty rate for minimal impact. Sterling's experiment should have ended there. But Sterling learned. He studied what went wrong. Parachute insertion was too unreliable in desert winds. Large groups were too visible. The operation had been too ambitious. He redesigned the entire concept. Instead of parachutes, they'd use vehicles, modified Willys jeeps that could navigate desert terrain. Instead of 50-man forces, they'd operate in 4 or 5-man teams. Instead of complex multi-target operations, they'd focus on single objectives with maximum impact. In December 1941, Stirling led a revised operation. 5 jeeps, 20 men, target, Luftwaffe airfield at Sirte. They drove 300 miles through unmapped desert, navigating by stars, avoiding German patrols through route selection rather than confrontation. They reached the airfield at 200 hours, placed explosive charges on aircraft, and were gone before guards understood what was happening. 24 aircraft destroyed, 0 casualties. The operation lasted 18 minutes. It was perfect. Over the next 6 months, SAS teams destroyed over 250 Axis aircraft, more than the entire RAF fighter command had shot down in the same period. They demolished fuel depots, ammunition stores, communication stations, railway lines. The German response was initially conventional. Increase guard forces, improve perimeter security, establish patrol patterns. None of it worked. The SAS simply waited, watched, learned the new patterns, and struck wherever the patterns were weakest. By mid-1942, Rommel's staff was documenting something troubling. They were facing an enemy that learned faster than they could adapt. Every defensive measure was eventually circumvented. Every patrol pattern was eventually exploited. The SAS operated inside the Wehrmacht's decision cycle, striking before responses could be formulated, disappearing before reinforcements arrived. Oberst Bremer, in his intelligence summaries, began noting a disturbing pattern. The British raiding forces demonstrate learning rates that suggest either superhuman intelligence or access to our communications. We believe the former. They observe, calculate, and adapt with speed that exceeds our defensive planning capacity. What made the SAS impossible to break wasn't their tactics. Tactics can be countered. It was their psychology. German military doctrine emphasized discipline, hierarchy, following orders. Soldiers were trained to execute commands from superior officers. The system worked brilliantly for conventional warfare, where coordinated mass action determined outcomes, but it created a vulnerability. German soldiers, even talented ones, waited for orders. The SAS didn't wait. Each patrol commander was trained to think like a theater commander. A 4-man SAS team deep behind enemy lines had no one to radio for permission, no chain of command to consult. They assessed situations, made strategic decisions, and executed them autonomously. If the planned target was too heavily defended, they'd shift to an alternative. If they encountered unexpected opportunities, they'd exploit them. If the situation changed, they'd adapt instantly. This created a phenomenon German intelligence officers found maddening. SAS operations were essentially unpredictable. You couldn't deduce their patterns because each team operated independently, making real-time decisions based on observed conditions. There was no central plan to intercept, no coordinated schedule to predict. Training was the key. Stirling's selection process filtered for men who could think independently, and the training developed that capability to extraordinary levels. SAS candidates learned to navigate without maps, to calculate distances and bearings mentally, to assess tactical situations and formulate responses within seconds. They were taught that orders were merely guidelines. Actual conditions determined actions. This was heresy in conventional military thinking, but it created soldiers who were tactically autonomous while remaining strategically aligned. A captured German intelligence document from March 1943, written by Major Klaus von dem Bach after interrogating captured SAS personnel, noted, "These men possess officer-level tactical thinking but operate at enlisted level. Each soldier functions as a complete military unit: navigation, strategy, logistics, combat. When we capture one, we gain nothing. He knows only his patrol's specific mission, and that mission becomes obsolete once he's captured. The British have created soldiers who think like commanders. Our doctrine has no counter to this." The psychological impact on German forces was significant. Airfield personnel lived in constant anxiety, knowing that any night might bring silent attackers who'd destroy millions of Reichsmarks worth of aircraft. Garrison commanders requested additional guards, better lighting, more patrols, all of which consumed resources desperately needed at the front lines. By 1943, the German response escalated. Hitler himself issued the Kommandobefehl, the commando order, mandating that all captured special forces soldiers be executed immediately, without trial or prisoner of war status. The order was born from frustration and fear. Conventional military responses weren't working, so Germany resorted to terror. If captured commandos were executed rather than interned, perhaps that would deter recruitment and operations. The order backfired psychologically. SAS soldiers, knowing capture meant death, fought with enhanced desperation when cornered, making them more dangerous, not less. And the order's existence, once Allied intelligence learned of it, became a propaganda tool and a rallying cry. More significantly, the Kommandobefehl revealed something crucial. Germany had no military solution to the SAS problem. Execution was an admission of tactical helplessness. The order stated explicitly that commandos and saboteurs were to be slaughtered to the last man because they posed grave danger to the German war effort. That phrase, grave danger, from forces numbering fewer than 400 men, spoke volumes about the psychological impact SAS operations had achieved. German defensive measures became increasingly elaborate and expensive. Airfields received multiple perimeter defenses, patrol units, lighting systems, and quick reaction forces. Supply depots were relocated away from vulnerable areas. Communication lines were buried or rerouted. The defensive measures worked. To some degree, SAS operations became more difficult and casualties increased. But the measures themselves consumed enormous resources. Every guard posted at a rear area airfield was a soldier, unavailable for the front lines. Every patrol unit searching deserts for commandos was fuel and manpower diverted from combat operations. The SAS achieved something remarkable. They forced Germany to defend everything, everywhere, all the time. A four-man SAS patrol might strike anywhere across hundreds of miles of desert. German forces had to protect every potential target, never knowing where the next raid would come. The resource imbalance was devastating. 4 British soldiers could force the deployment of hundreds of German troops to defend potential targets. Meanwhile, in England, SAS training intensified and recruitment expanded. Sterling had proven the concept. Now it needed scaling. Volunteers flooded in, British, Commonwealth, Free French, even some liberated prisoners from occupied countries. The training standards remained savage, the washout rate remained high, but those who passed became part of an elite that was redefining warfare. The expansion of SAS operations into Europe after North Africa revealed the doctrine's adaptability. In France before D-Day, SAS teams parachuted into occupied territory to coordinate with resistance networks, conduct reconnaissance, and sabotage German defenses. In Italy, they operated in mountainous terrain utterly different from North African deserts. In the Aegean, they conducted amphibious raids on island garrisons. The tactics changed completely based on terrain and mission, but the underlying principle remained constant. Small, autonomous teams, highly trained, thinking independently, adapting constantly. German after-action reports from France in 1944 documented the psychological toll. Wehrmacht units stationed in rear areas, supposedly safe from frontline combat, lived in perpetual anxiety. SAS teams, sometimes dressed in civilian clothes or German uniforms, could appear anywhere. They'd cut communication lines, ambush supply columns, assassinate officers, and vanish. The French resistance, coordinated by SAS liaison teams, became dramatically more effective. Major Wilhelm Schaefer, commanding a German garrison in Brittany, wrote in June 1944, "We control the towns during daylight. At night we control nothing. The British commandos and their French collaborators own the darkness. My soldiers are exhausted from constant alert status. Morale degenerates daily. We are an army under siege from an enemy we cannot see, cannot predict, and cannot engage decisively." The economic calculus was brutal for Germany. Every SAS soldier represented perhaps $10,000 in training and equipment investment, but each one forced Germany to deploy 50 times that value in defensive resources. A single SAS team operating in occupied France might tie down an entire battalion of German troops in security operations. This wasn't warfare as traditionally understood. It was economic warfare through military means, achieving strategic impact through minimal force precisely applied. The German High Command understood this. Intelligence summaries from 1944 show clear recognition that Special Forces operations were creating disproportionate resource drains. But understanding the problem didn't solve it. The Wehrmacht's doctrine, its training systems, its entire military culture was built on mass, coordination, and hierarchical command. Replicating the SAS model would require fundamental restructuring, and even if Germany tried, they lacked the time, resources, and perhaps the cultural flexibility. The SAS model worked because it emerged from British military culture's odd tolerance for eccentricity and independent thinking. German military culture valued discipline and obedience above improvisation and autonomy. The human cost was substantial. SAS casualty rates were horrific by conventional standards. Roughly 30% killed in action over the course of the war, far higher than regular infantry. Many were executed under the Kommandobefehl when captured. Others died in operations that failed, because not every raid succeeded. The training itself killed several men during the selection process. This wasn't warfare where you could hide in masses of other soldiers. SAS operations meant constant exposure, constant risk, constant responsibility, yet recruitment never faltered. Men volunteered knowing the odds, knowing the risks, because the SAS offered something the regular army didn't: agency. In conventional units, soldiers followed orders and hoped their officers were competent. In the SAS, soldiers made decisions that affected outcomes. They weren't cogs in a machine. They were autonomous operators trusted with strategic responsibility. That trust attracted a specific personality type: intelligent, aggressive, creative, and willing to accept extraordinary risk in exchange for extraordinary responsibility. David Stirling himself was captured in January 1943 and spent the rest of the war in Colditz Castle, the high-security prisoner facility for incorrigible Allied officers. His absence could have destroyed the SAS, but the organization he'd built was resilient precisely because it didn't depend on centralized command. Other officers, Paddy Mayne, Bill Stirling, Brian Franks, stepped up and continued operations without missing a beat. The decentralization that made SAS patrols effective also made the organization itself adaptable and resilient. The German response evolved throughout 1944 and 1945, but never effectively countered the SAS model. They tried creating their own special forces units, Brandenburgers and other commando formations, but these operated within conventional command structures and never achieved the autonomous decision-making that made the SAS effective. German special forces could execute complex operations when ordered, but they couldn't improvise and adapt at the tactical level the way SAS teams routinely did. The cultural and doctrinal barriers were insurmountable. By late 1944, as Germany retreated on all fronts, SAS operations shifted toward supporting conventional advances. Teams operated ahead of regular forces, securing bridges, cutting German communication lines, preventing demolitions, capturing key terrain. The autonomous operational model that had been developed for raiding behind enemy lines proved equally effective for conventional advance support. The SAS had become a Swiss Army knife, useful for any military task requiring intelligence, adaptability, and initiative. The true measure of SAS effectiveness emerged in post-war analysis, when researchers could examine both Allied and German records. The numbers were staggering. Fewer than 400 SAS soldiers operating over 4 years had destroyed or damaged over 400 aircraft, hundreds of vehicles, countless supply dumps, and dozens of infrastructure targets. More importantly, they'd forced Germany to divert thousands of soldiers to rear area security duties, consuming fuel, ammunition, and manpower desperately needed elsewhere. The British Army Operational Research Group calculated that each SAS soldier generated approximately 150 times their weight in enemy resource expenditure. No other military unit achieved comparable return on investment. But the numbers, impressive as they were, missed the deeper impact. The SAS had demonstrated that warfare was changing. Industrial-age military doctrine emphasized mass. Whoever fielded larger forces with better production capacity would prevail. The SAS proved that precision could counter mass, that small numbers of highly capable soldiers could achieve strategic impact through careful target selection and operational flexibility. This realization influenced post-war military doctrine worldwide. The American Green Berets, the Soviet Spetsnaz, Israel's Sayeret Matkal, all emerged from recognition that the SAS model worked. Modern special forces doctrine, across all major militaries, traces directly back to Stirling's desert experiments in 1941-1942. The emphasis on selection over training, finding the right personalities rather than trying to create them, on autonomous decision-making, on multi-domain capability, on strategic thinking at the tactical level, All of this became standard Special Forces doctrine because the SAS proved it worked. The German admission that they could never break the SAS wasn't just tactical assessment. It was recognition that they'd encountered a new form of warfare against which their existing doctrine had no answer. The admission came in various forms across multiple documents. Rommel himself wrote in his North African War Diary about the British Special Forces who operate with such independence and effectiveness that conventional countermeasures prove inadequate. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, in testimony at Nuremberg, was asked about the Kommandobefehl and responded, "The order was issued because normal military operations could not contain or eliminate the British commando forces. They were too mobile, too unpredictable, and frankly too capable." Even in defeat and facing execution, German officers acknowledged what they'd faced, an enemy that had reimagined warfare. The cultural factors deserve examination because they explain why Britain created the SAS and Germany couldn't effectively counter it. British military culture, despite its reputation for tradition and formality, had always maintained odd tolerance for eccentricity. Lawrence of Arabia, Gordon of Khartoum, Wingate in Burma. The British Army had a long history of giving unconventional officers room to experiment. This wasn't official policy, more like cultural quirk, but it created space for innovations that more rigidly hierarchical militaries would have suppressed. David Stirling was, by conventional standards, a terrible officer, undisciplined, argumentative, willing to bypass chain of command when convenient. In many militaries, he'd have been cashiered early, but British military culture tolerated his eccentricities long enough for him to prove his concepts worked. Once proven, institutional support followed. German military culture, by contrast, valued discipline and obedience as cardinal virtues. The German general staff system produced tactically brilliant officers, but within strict doctrinal frameworks. Innovation was encouraged, but within established parameters. The kind of radical rethinking Stirling proposed, throwing out most conventional military wisdom and starting fresh, would have been rejected as fundamentally undermining military order. This cultural difference manifested in training. SAS training deliberately broke down conventional military discipline and rebuilt soldiers as autonomous thinkers. German Special Forces training, by contrast, created exceptionally skilled soldiers who still operated within command hierarchies. Both produced elite units, but with fundamentally different capabilities. The SAS model also required trusting junior ranks with strategic responsibility, something British culture permitted more readily than German. A 23-year-old SAS lieutenant, deep behind enemy lines, might make decisions affecting theater-level operations. British command culture accepted this because the alternative, trying to maintain direct control over dispersed special operations, was impossible. German command culture found this delegation deeply uncomfortable. Orders flowed down. Information flowed up. Junior officers executed plans. They didn't formulate them. There were exceptions. German military history includes brilliant junior officers making autonomous decisions, but these were exceptions to doctrine, not expressions of it. The SAS made autonomous junior decision-making the core operational principle. Post-war interviews with German officers consistently noted this cultural difference. They'd faced extraordinarily capable soldiers who operated with officer-level authority, but at enlisted man scale. The German military system had no framework for understanding or countering this model. By 1945, as war ended in Europe, the SAS had expanded to multiple regiments and operated across all theaters. The original L detachment had grown into 1st and 2nd SAS regiments, British, 3rd and 4th SAS regiments, French, plus Belgian and Greek squadrons. Total strength exceeded 2,500 men, still tiny compared to conventional forces, but a massive expansion from Stirling's original 60-man unit. The model had proven scalable. The post-war fate of the SAS reflected institutional ambivalence toward special forces. In October 1945, the SAS was disbanded. The British military establishment, never entirely comfortable with elite units that operated outside normal command structures, moved to reintegrate Special Forces soldiers into conventional units. The official reasoning was that wartime expedients were no longer necessary. The actual reasoning likely involved conventional military hierarchy reasserting itself over wartime innovation. But the disbandment lasted only 6 years. The Malayan emergency, communist insurgency in British Malaya, created situations where conventional forces proved ineffective. In 1951, The SAS was reformed as 22 SAS Regiment, specifically for counterinsurgency operations. The regiment's structure and doctrine drew directly from Sterling's original concepts: small autonomous teams, operating independently, adapting to local conditions, thinking strategically while acting tactically. Over subsequent decades, 22 SAS became the template for special forces worldwide. Its operations remained largely secret, but its reputation grew through occasional public operations, the Iranian embassy siege in 1980 being the most famous. Modern special forces operations across all major militaries reflect SAS doctrine: careful selection, brutal training, emphasis on autonomous decision-making, multi-domain capability, and strategic thinking at tactical level. The German admission that they could never break the SAS resonated, because it proved true not just tactically, but institutionally. The SAS model survived and proliferated precisely because it worked in ways conventional military structures couldn't match. Today, every major military maintains special forces units operating on principles Sterling established in 1941. The selection processes, training methodologies, operational doctrines, all trace back to desert experiments with modified jeeps and soldiers who thought like commanders. The German officers who documented their inability to counter this new form of warfare were witnessing the birth of modern special operations, a transformation in military practice, as significant as the introduction of tanks or aircraft. The individual stories illuminate the doctrine. Consider Paddy Mayne, an Irish rugby player who became one of the SAS's most effective commanders. Mayne personally destroyed over 100 aircraft during North African operations, often working alone or with a single partner. His approach was methodical: careful reconnaissance, patient observation of guard routines, precise timing, and ruthless execution. He'd infiltrate airfields at night, place explosive charges on parked aircraft, and be gone before detonation. His kill rate exceeded that of many fighter pilots, but his weapon was time delay explosives rather than machine guns. Mayne exemplified SAS selection criteria: physically powerful, tactically intelligent, and psychologically comfortable, operating alone behind enemy lines. He survived the war and lived until 1955, dying in a car accident in Northern Ireland. His service records remained classified for decades, but fellow SAS soldiers remembered him as the perfect embodiment of Sterling's vision: a soldier who thought like a general, but fought like a guerrilla. Or consider Lieutenant André Zernheld, a Free French officer who joined the SAS in 1942. Zernheld was a philosopher and poet who wrote extensively about warfare and courage. He articulated the SAS ethos in writing better than anyone: "When I set out on patrol, I carry my life and my death with me. Every decision is mine alone. I am not just a soldier, I am the entire army at that moment and place. I bear the weight of victory or defeat in my individual actions." Zernheld was killed in July 1942 during a raid on an airfield in Libya. He was 27. He'd destroyed 18 aircraft in 6 operations over 3 months. His papers, recovered after the war, became required reading in French Special Forces training. Or consider Sergeant Reg Seekings, a working-class English soldier who became one of the SAS's most accomplished operators. Seekings had been a pre-war laborer with no formal education beyond primary school, but he possessed spatial intelligence, mechanical aptitude, and most importantly, the ability to assess tactical situations and make sound decisions under extreme stress. He completed over 30 operations behind enemy lines, survived the war, and returned to civilian life working as a carpenter. His story illustrated that SAS capability wasn't about class or formal education. It was about specific cognitive and psychological attributes that transcended social background. The German documentation of SAS effectiveness grew more detailed and reluctantly admiring as the war progressed. A particularly revealing document surfaced in 1998 from Wehrmacht archives. A comprehensive analysis written in early 1945 by General der Panzertruppe Fritz Bayerlein, who'd served under Rommel in North Africa. Bayerlein wrote, "The British Special Air Service represents the most significant tactical innovation of the war. They understood before we did that modern warfare's complexity creates vulnerability. Our extended supply lines, our reliance on fuel and ammunition depots, our concentration of aircraft on forward airfields, all necessary for mechanized warfare, all vulnerable to precise attack. The SAS exploited this vulnerability perfectly. What defeats conventional forces, distance from support, isolation, exposure, empowers them. They need no supply lines because they carry minimal equipment. They need no reinforcement because they don't hold ground. They need no complex coordination because each team operates independently. We built an elaborate military machine, and they designed a weapon specifically to break machines. I do not believe we could have countered them even with unlimited resources. The problem wasn't force strength, it was conceptual. They were fighting a different kind of war than we understood how to defend against. Our doctrine had no answer because our doctrine couldn't conceive the question they posed. This analysis, written by a senior German officer with extensive experience fighting the SAS, captured the essence of why Germany couldn't break them. It wasn't about tactics or equipment or even courage. It was about fundamental military philosophy. The Wehrmacht was the pinnacle of industrial-age military doctrine, massive, mechanized, coordinated, and hierarchically controlled. The SAS represented post-industrial warfare, distributed, autonomous, adaptive, and intellectually, rather than numerically superior. The two paradigms were nearly incompatible, like watching a sword fighter duel a sniper. Bayerlein's analysis was never published during his lifetime. He died in 1970, and his papers remained in family archives until donated to military historians. But the document circulated among defense strategists in the 1990s and influenced thinking about asymmetric warfare and special operations doctrine. The admission from a German general that the SAS posed a conceptual challenge rather than merely a tactical one validated what military theorists had suspected. The SAS represented a genuine revolution in warfare, not just an evolutionary improvement. The climax of understanding came not in battle but in reflection. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Allied intelligence teams systematically interviewed captured German officers about their wartime experiences. These interviews, conducted by specialized teams including military historians and strategists, sought to understand what had worked and what hadn't from both sides' perspectives. The interviews about Special Forces operations revealed a consistent pattern. German officers across ranks and theaters expressed similar sentiments. The SAS and similar units had operated at a level that exceeded German countermeasures. Not because German forces were incompetent, they were highly professional, but because the operational paradigm was fundamentally different. One interview conducted with Oberst Heinrich Bremmer, the same officer who'd interrogated that smiling prisoner in 1942, captured the essence. Bremmer had spent 3 years attempting to counter SAS operations in North Africa and Italy. The interviewer asked, "Why couldn't you stop them?" Bremmer's response, "We couldn't stop them because we were trying to fight them as if they were soldiers. They weren't soldiers in any sense we understood. They were, I don't know the right word, autonomous warfare agents. Each one was a complete military operation compressed into a single person. When we captured one, we learned nothing useful. When we killed one, nothing changed. When we reinforced defenses, they simply struck elsewhere. We were playing chess. They were playing something else entirely. You cannot win a game when your opponent is playing by different rules you don't understand." The interviewer pressed. "But surely with enough resources, enough guards, enough patrols." Bremmer interrupted. "No, that's the point. The resource equation favored them overwhelmingly. Each of their soldiers forced us to deploy 50 of ours in defensive roles. If they'd had 4,000 instead of 400, we would have needed 200,000 soldiers for rear area security. Impossible. The mathematics of their model were devastating. Small numbers of highly capable autonomous operators defeating large numbers of conventional soldiers through superior decision-making and target selection. We had no doctrine for this, no counter-strategy. We could only endure it and hope they made mistakes. They rarely did." That admission, from a professional German officer, stripped of propaganda and wartime rhetoric, represented the clearest articulation of why Germany couldn't break the SAS. It wasn't about courage or equipment. It was about warfare paradigms, and Germany's paradigm had no answer to the question the SAS posed. The legacy of those early SAS operations extends far beyond World War II. Every modern Special Forces unit, regardless of nation, operates on principles established in North African deserts between 1941 and 1943. Rigorous selection, brutal training, autonomous decision-making, strategic thinking at tactical levels, and the understanding that small numbers of exceptional soldiers can achieve strategic impact through precision and adaptability. The model proved so effective that it became universal military doctrine for special operations. The German admission that they could never break the SAS wasn't just tactical assessment. It was recognition that warfare itself had evolved beyond industrial-age mass mobilization. The future belonged to precision, intelligence, and adaptability, rather than sheer numbers. This lesson, learned painfully by German forces facing SAS operations, shaped post-war military development worldwide. Every nation that studied World War II recognized that the SAS had pioneered something revolutionary. David Sterling lived until 2003, dying at age 88. He spent post-war years involved in various business ventures and security consultancies, occasionally advising military organizations on special operations doctrine. He never served in combat again after his 1943 capture, but his influence on military practice exceeded that of most generals who commanded vast forces. He'd proven that a lieutenant with a radical idea could reshape warfare more profoundly than divisions of conventional soldiers. The SAS continues today as 22 SAS Regiment, operating in conflicts worldwide, still selection-obsessed, still training soldiers to think like commanders, still achieving disproportionate impact through small numbers precisely applied. The counter-terrorism role has expanded, but the core doctrine remains unchanged from Sterling's original vision. Find extraordinary individuals, train them to near superhuman capability, trust them with strategic responsibility, and turn them loose to solve impossible problems. The German officers who documented their inability to counter this model were witnessing military history's inflection point. They understood, perhaps better than Allied leadership initially did, that the SAS represented not just a successful unit, but a fundamental reimagining of what soldiers could be and what warfare could become. Their admission of failure was actually recognition of transformation, the acknowledgement that war itself had changed, and they'd been fighting the new war with old paradigms. In the end, it wasn't weapons or numbers or courage that made the SAS unbreakable. It was the simple, revolutionary idea that soldiers could be trusted to think, trained to decide, and empowered to act autonomously in pursuit of strategic goals. That idea, proven in desert raids against airfields in 1942, remains the foundation of special operations worldwide. Germany couldn't break it because it wasn't breakable. It was evolution.